I just mentioned conflicts of interest, as always. There's a book which I've just done, Autism for Parents and Teachers. There's another book which is about to come out on evidence-based treatments in autism, which will be an interesting thing. And also I should note that I edit the Journal of Autism, of which Dr. Minshew is an associate editor. I want to thank a number of colleagues who are going to be talking about some of their research that's relevant to this topic today. And it's very important we start out with Lee O'Connor. He's the first person who described autism. He said back in 1943 that there were 11 children he saw that had two things that were unusual. One was autism, living in their own world, and the other was that they had trouble with change in the non-social world. So this is a child who seemed somewhat oblivious to their parents, and yet they would notice the cracks in the floor, or the lights in the ceiling, or the light switches on the wall. They would get very upset with change. It's an interesting and somewhat paradoxical observation, and I want you to keep it in mind today as we talk, because we would like to understand that. Why is there this seeming lack of interest in the social world, but an over-engagement with the non-social world? After 1943, there were many years of confusion. What was autism? One of the things that's interesting as time has gone on, there's been more consensus, and despite, I think, its many limitations, one of the great beauties of things like DSM is it gives people at least something to work with and from. As a result, we've seen research increase. Let me say a little bit about understanding this paradox in autism. Why is it that most babies come into the world from the moment of birth, they want to play the social game with their mothers, but children with autism may be more interested in spinning a 7-Up bottle? There are different theoretical models, and Dr. Minshew alluded to some of these. They all have their pros and cons, and they have some limitations as well as their strengths. But these are approaches basically from the psychological side to understand what is going wrong in autism. One of the things that people generally agree on, and you actually heard Dr. Minshew allude to this, is that there's a general consensus there's trouble with people with autism in looking at faces. This is one of the earliest ways we make contact with people. It's one of the earliest things that babies engage in from the moment of birth. They're interested in the face. It's the most interesting visual stimulus in the world to the baby is the face and the voice of the parent. And so what is it about faces that's unusual in autism? And I want to talk some about that today because much of our research is centered around this. Starting in the 1990s, a number of papers began to show some differences in how faces were perceived in children with autism. A number of different tasks and procedures were used. These have gotten increasingly sophisticated as time has gone on. The findings indicate a relative lack of relevance of some aspects of the face, especially things like emotions and sort of facial recognition, the inside part of the face. Other things, like is the person wearing a hat or not wearing a hat, that may be very relevant to the person with autism. This has also led people to look at the processes that underlie looking at faces. In one study that we did now, actually a little over 10 years ago, we looked at a task that had to do with facial memory, and I'll show you an example in just a second. And we had groups here of children with autism, with PDD, and with developmental delays, but not with autism. And we're looking at how selective is this problem in facial memory. And these were children about 6.5 years old. And this is a sample of the task. This is not one that was actually used. This is actually a little harder than what was on this task. So here's a person. Now find the person. And it's interesting because the person is there, but it takes a while of looking. And as I say, the tasks we used with the children were simpler. Whoops. There we go. Next one, please. The interesting thing, the children with autism, they were performing at about half the level of the children with developmental disabilities. They really had a much more selective problem remembering faces. Other things, they actually did much better than the children with developmental disabilities without autism. Now, there's a whole body of work in psychology on faces and how we develop our ability to recognize faces. From the time of birth, we know typical babies are very interested in the faces. They tend to look at the top half of the face. By 2 to 3 months, they start to recognize faces based on the internal features. By 6 months, you see the facial inversion effect, which I'll show you in 1 second. And you also see gender discrimination. By 6 months, babies can start to tell men and women apart. By 9 months, you get stranger anxiety, responses to people who are unfamiliar, which means babies know who is familiar. You also see the species effect, which is before 9 months, Babies can tell monkeys apart. After 9 months, not so easy, but they're very good telling people apart. And there are lots of other changes over time. And here's the facial inversion effect in autism. Does anybody recognize, I'm sure Dr. Minshew will recognize, the gentleman whose face is upside down? Brad Pitt, a very famous person. It's hard for us after about 6 months of age, if we're typically developing, to recognize people's faces if they're upside down. Try it when you leave Catania at the airport and see what happens. You won't fly. People will say, turn it up, I can't recognize you. And that's this facial inversion effect. One of the interesting things in autism, there's some literature and there's a little bit of debate on it, but the bottom line is it doesn't seem to happen as robustly. And people with autism do just as well, right side up, upside down face. An interesting observation. Now, all this is limited so far to using photographs and other still faces, and we'll talk about that. We know something about the social brain in terms, as you heard from Dr. Minshew, the brain is a very complicated bit of business, but things are happening in different parts of the brain in terms of some areas that take certain aspects of processing and coordination with others. I want to focus for 1 second on a part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, which is a part on the underside of your brain, in the sort of temporal area, which seems for most of us to be very involved in looking at faces. I'm going to show you the results. Do people watch The Simpsons in Europe? Yes? Yes? Just to remind people, structural MRI is looking at brain structure, functional MRI is looking at function, and usually by comparing two tasks. So in this task, and my colleague Bob Schultz was the first author, this came out now, some years ago. It's been replicated many times, fortunately, so it doesn't just work in New Haven. But in this task, we were looking at faces versus objects. And these were high-functioning people with autism and Asperger's compared to typically developing people. And the task was the same every time. Same or different, same or different, same or different, same or different. They've got buttons they push while they're processing this in the magnet. And so here are some of the stimuli. Same or different person? Same or different? Different. You'll notice no hats, no ears. We make them focus on the face. Same or different? Same. But you'll see because of the mask, we can adjust. And the important thing to know is that these tasks are done, the people with autism, Asperger's, and the typicals, they're equally as right. So they're not different in terms of right or wrong, because we didn't want that. What we wanted to see is if they can do something equally well, how does the brain process? And we're looking at that area called the fusiform gyrus. And here's the results. For the typical people, we get blood that goes to that face area of the brain when they're looking at the faces, not when they're looking at the objects. But here are the individuals with autism and Asperger's, and we don't see that. In fact, what they are activating is somewhat forward the part of the brain that the rest of us use for objects, which is interesting when you get back to thinking about that facial inversion business. What if they're seeing faces like they see every other object in the world? But the face doesn't have that quite specialness, and it's not processed in that special place. And that may then have important developmental implications. If faces aren't so relevant to you, you may not be able to read the face of your mom or dad to have them tell you what's relevant to look at or what's not relevant to look at. So things like attentional processes that may really very early in life get entrained in this whole business. Now we have one other study by way of interesting example of a fortuitous case. This was an 11-year-old boy studied by one of our, I think at this point in time he was a research assistant. He's now finished medical school, I think is in psychiatry training in Boston, Dave Grillotti. This boy with autism had an interest in something called Digimon. People know Digimon in the audience? I had girls, so I didn't know anything about Digimon. He knew a lot about Digimon. And so we did this same study with this boy, faces, objects, no activation of that face area. For Digimon, over the faces. For the Digimon character, over the faces, including faces of family members. For Digimon, he turned that area on. So it's not that it couldn't work. It's what it worked for, which underscores the connectivity that, Dr. Minshew was talking about. And finally, this is finally a very interesting study from my colleague, Dr. Kevin Pelfrey. You can't see it because I'm not showing you the videos. These are people turned into dots, and they move, and they do things. And one's right side up, one's upside down. And we can make these things happen in the magnet. We can make them act more like just random dots. We can make the dots turn into people. And the interesting thing in this study that Kevin's the first author of, the typical children actually look one way, but the children with autism look very differently. But the children who are brothers and sisters of the children with autism look a bit more in the middle, in fact, looking more like the children with autism, even though they're typically developing. And again, this suggests to us that there's some very interesting potential ways to look at mechanisms as they're then expressed in siblings that may help us understand something more about the processes in autism.